Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And this is the episode about replayability in games. Today's episode is a What We Talk About episode where we're going to talk about all about replayability. Recently, we talked about our most played games of all time as a sort of exploratory conversation leading up to this. We also talked about and did a deep dive of Santa Monica, a game in which we ended up mostly talking about variability, which will play into this discussion. So we've been building over the course of the last half month or so to this milestone, fingers crossed, What We Talk About episode about replayability. I think we're going to talk about different factors that can increase a game's replayability, if replayability even matters, how do gimmicks factor into this, what the differences are between replayable games and good games, and a whole bunch more. So this might be a winding, sweeping conversation like a lot of our What We Talk About, but there's a lot on the list. Oh, also, we might talk about video games. We'll see.
Yeah, if we have room for it, I think that would be a fun one too, because video games are things that are culturally just played and replayed so much. So I think there are potentially some really interesting insights there to get into. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think it'll be a good one, and one hopefully that will fuel even more robust discussion and conversation in our Discord. So if listening to this episode sparks any thoughts for you, we would love it if you would hop into our Discord and contribute to the conversation, because this show at its best is an opportunity for us to all learn from each other about games, board games, video games, and the decisions in them.
And if you want to do that, you can find a link to our Discord in our show notes or on decisionspacepodcast.com. But now, let's just do it, Jake.
Straight into it.
Let's define replayability.
You know, it's hard to do it without like using the term in it, but
Yeah.
I feel like replayability is just like a game that gets played again. You know what
sure.
I mean? Like it has to have some kind of actual practical. It's not enough just to want to play a game. I think it has to be a game that you're actually playing, a game that actually demands to be played many times. That is the mark of a replayable game. I think that's impossible to answer. I think many is going to be, you know, just dependent on any person, right? Maybe somebody who has 1,000 games, you know, playing 10 is at the end of their bell curve, like an outlier for replayability, versus somebody who has 3 games and is playing all of those all the time, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like a replayable game is like a game that is an outlier for you and your gaming habits.
I think also, as we were sort of thinking through, as I was writing these notes for the show and kind of trying to think through planning things out, I thought about this question a little bit, Jake. And I think that it also depends on the opportunity cost of the game itself, right? So like a game that takes 4 hours, the opportunity cost of replaying it is higher. So what counts as replayable for that is going to be fewer plays in terms of like, this is a really replayable game. It's an experience I want to have multiple times,
right?
Versus a game that takes 20 minutes.
If you play, what's Twilight Imperium. If you play Twilight Imperium twice a year, every year,
it's
like
replayable.
That is an extremely replayable game to you, in my opinion, because you're setting aside an entire afternoon, or maybe afternoon and evening twice a year just to have this one experience, right? You're going out of your way to curate that experience.
Yep. And I had, as a working definition, a game that players can play multiple times or repeatedly without tiring of the experience of playing it. And I think for me, the without tiring is an important aspect of this, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. Like I have to, for a game that feels replayable to me, I'm motivated to go out and continue to play it. And there's aspects of experiencing the game that no matter if I've played it 1 time or 10 times or 50 times, leave me wanting more and leave me wanting to come back to it. And one other question. I don't think this is in terms of all media, right? Like movies can be replayable because we can watch movies multiple times.
You click play again.
Yeah. Like people, I don't think this is a unique thing to games. People read novels multiple times.
And you click play again on the audiobook.
On the audiobook, right. Yeah. But you understand it and appreciate it on a deeper level. And I think that board games are similar, but I would argue that board games within our culture, or games in general, there's this understanding in film or in literature that you could just read a book once and appreciate how wonderful of a text it is, or watch a movie once and appreciate just how phenomenal of a movie it is, even though you could re-experience those experiences multiple times,
And
right?
even get more out of it a second
A
time
second
in
time.
those mediums.
But there's this perception within how we consume board games that replayability is even more important
Yeah.
to game experiences than those other media experiences. So I don't really know if I have more to say about that right now, but I just think that that's interesting, that in terms of how we as consumers of art and of media, there's something unique about games to some extent in the way that we talk about them culturally, where we value replayability a little greater than we do in terms of those other types of media.
I agree. I think that's a really interesting thought, and it makes me think of music too,
Sure.
where replayability is huge there. I think most people who are fans of an artist, right? They don't listen to
Dang,
a
I
new
listened to the White
album.
Album once. It was
Yeah,
so good.
I
Yeah.
feel like I had my White Album experience, and then I moved on to the next album.
Yep.
I wonder if it is just a function of time. It
Mm,
takes a lot longer to
read a book.
read a book than it does to play most games or most
Mhm.
books and most games. Movies are but then movies, that's equivalent to a game time. But I think you're right. It doesn't feel like replayability matters as
Yeah.
much in that medium as it does in some others. And then video games, it kind of straddles the line more, where it's like a narrative game, like a triple A narrative game. I feel like you play it and that's kind of what you're expected to do, like The Last of Us. And
Sure.
then versus, like, we talk a lot about fighting games or like competitive games
Sure.
or
Dota.
Tetris, whatever, that
Oh,
people are,
I I was
or
listening to
Candy Crush. You play like one
oh
level of
no.
Candy Crush.
I'm done. I was listening to a podcast about Tetris today, and I'm so glad it came up because I think Tetris is one of the most eminently replayable video games ever made. So maybe we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
And
So anyway,
I think you're right to
interesting.
hone in on narrative as being a key difference, right? Like music doesn't often have a strong narrative, or it's not the reason why we're necessarily drawn to music.
Right.
Right? It's evoking a feeling. It's evoking a sense of a state of being, just like board games are evoking an experience or an agency, or it's about a puzzle. Whereas maybe with books, with literature, and with film, it's more about the narrative experience. So you can read it once or watch it once and kind of get the gist of it. And then if you want to go back, there's other reasons too.
Last thought on music, like with albums,
Yeah.
I find myself will listen to albums that I really like and interested in a narrative way first, right? I'll
Mm,
listen to the album, but then I'll pick and choose and go back to like the most replayable tracks
totally.
more often than not.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think narrative is a key thing with replayability, and I don't think, as we get into our board game discussion about replayability, probably narrative games are going to come to the top of our list for fulfilling some of the characteristics that we think make a game more replayable.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, Jake, let's pivot. Let's get into the nitty gritty here a little bit and just talk about factors that can increase a game's replayability. And I've grouped this into 6 different core categories, many of which are inspired by this awesome blog post on Board Game Geek from Tony Faber called "What Makes Games Replayable and Does It Matter If They Are?" On Tony Faber's blog, The Secrets of Great Games. So I just want to mention that at the start because I found it tremendously helpful in terms of structuring the notes here. And the first one I think is really important, and it's also the most basic, so we just need to say it and get it out of the way. Games that have automatic decisions are just less replayable than games that don't have automatic decisions. So what we mean by that, right, is if you play a game once or twice and all of a sudden it's easy to make all the decisions in the game, the heuristics are obvious, there's not a lot of randomness in the game, there's not a lot of variability, the game starts to play itself, that's not going to hold your attention for that long.
Agreed. And I think it speaks to the really important part of your definition about playing repeatedly without getting tired of it, because
Mm-hmm.
many of us have played a lot of tic-tac-toe in our lives when we
Right.
were kids. Maybe the same with Connect 4 or a game like that. And so just because you've played it a lot doesn't necessarily mean it's the greatest, most replayable game, because most of us, and no shit, you know what? I don't want to yuck your yum. If you love Connect 4 to this day and love
It's
playing it
great.
with kids, that's awesome. But I think most people play Connect 4 at a certain point in their life, and then they move on to other games that they
Yeah.
would be more interested in playing.
Yep. Totally. And I think there's other cultural reasons outside of enjoying the game experience itself that we do that.
Which I think is an important distinction to make, because that says that there's something about replayability beyond just playing something many times.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
you know,
Totally.
there's something else there.
I have here too, Jake, that even some Euro games, which aren't speculative enough, could fall into this category, right? Where it's purely an optimization puzzle. I think eventually can just start to be like, oh, I could just sit down and solve the puzzle of this game. And then I kind of have a sense for what basically, it plays itself. I don't need to be here. The right decisions are obvious. So I don't need to make them, right? Like it's more interesting to play a game when you have to make judgment calls than it is when you don't.
Okay,
And I think that,
yeah, what games come to mind? You can't say something like that without giving at least an example or two.
it's one game that comes to mind, despite me playing it a lot, is Villagers. Eventually,
Okay.
I feel like got to a point for me, Jake, where I felt like the decisions started to feel kind of automatic, just based on the options available to you at any given point in that game. I think Can't Stop does not fall into this category for me, because there's moments where you have to take these incredible risks that are really fun. There's just like a very fun game. But ultimately, Can't Stop, I think there's like a worse version of Can't Stop that feels like totally boring, and there's no speculation, right? And you just
Right.
have forced decisions. But Can't Stop is not. It's like eminently replayable.
Yeah,
and wonderful.
a game like Can't Stop or Claim It, just with
Mhm.
the decisions you make without the push your luck aspect,
Yep.
definitely would fall into that, where it's like I can make an optimal placement. It's just the actual game is deciding whether to try to make another placement.
Totally. And I think that's an important I'm really glad we're talking about this right now during this like automatic decisions factor, in part because I think that Can't Stop's almost an example of like Can't Stop is replayable because it's really fun to make risky decisions and then to have them work, more so than it's interesting to make difficult decisions and have them play out, right? Like nothing in Can't Stop is all that difficult of a decision often. It's just sort of like it's just fun
Yeah,
to play a push your luck game like that.
I feel like this is already going in a direction where like replayable games are fun and good.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Good. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. Okay. So maybe we forge ahead.
Yeah, let's move on to the next one, which is variable setup. So
Okay.
what comes to mind for you when you put this on the nose?
Well, it turns out that a game that is different every time, but has the same shared rule set, turns out to be a really replayable experience, right?
Right.
The original sin of board games, more or less, is that I have to sit down and I have to spend oftentimes an equal amount of time learning the rules of a game as I will spend playing it for the first time. That's a huge barrier to entry compared to the other media we've already talked about on the show, right? Like I don't have to relearn how to listen to music. I don't have to relearn to read a book.
Wow,
But to
somebody
play
who
a board
wasn't a
game,
musical studies major and it shows.
you weren't either.
No, but
okay, great. I take any and all shade, but
I never learned to list how to listen the first time.
okay. That makes more sense now. But with board games, you do have to invest the time. So I think variable setup is this incredible cheat code for getting different experience with the same core rules. So it bends sort of the core drawback in some ways of board games, and it means that you can come back to that same well and have a meaningfully different experience. So you asked for examples. So I think these fall into roughly two categories for me in terms of variable setup. There's dissimilar scoring, where each time you play, the rules around how you might win the game are different. So two games that came to mind for me just right away that I've played a lot of are so they're replayable for me, are Cascadia, where the scoring cards are different every time, or Calico, a game where each player has their own unique scoring conditions on their board, but the puzzle is the same every time outside of the scoring. And then there's also dissimilar agencies, right? Variable asymmetric player powers, things like Vadis, where you all have a unique player power that you can use in negotiation, or Root, where you basically have a completely different game each of you are playing in a shared space with similar rules, or a game like Cosmic Encounter, where you have a unique alien power that fundamentally breaks a core rule of the game. So I think both of those are examples of those sort of overarching categories of how games often do variable setup that lead to the games being different every time, despite mostly having similar rules.
Does just like a big deck of cards come in here as well? Like, does just general variability?
I
A
think
game, right, where you draw a hand of cards like Race for the Galaxy, right? You're never going to, even if just you're playing base Race for the Galaxy, you're never going to play the same exact game twice.
I think for me that's going to fall into our next category,
Okay.
which is randomness, which we'll come back to. What do you think? Do you agree?
I mean, I think when you say variable setup, I think
Mm-hmm.
part of what I hear is just variability, which is something we've
Sure.
talked about a lot. And I think, yeah, randomness is sort of the thing that makes having a big deck of cards add variability to the game, but you still have to have a big deck of cards to be showing players different things for that randomness to really facilitate it.
I think my differentiating factor, I totally hear what you're saying, Jake. And I think that like in Race, at least in the base game of Race for the Galaxy, right? The deck is always the
A
same.
highly replayable game, by the way, for me.
Yeah. And for most, I think for many people, one of the eminent appeals of Race for the Galaxy is its replayability. It's quick
Right.
and it's different every time. But I think that a huge part of that is not that it's a variable setup.
Though it kind of is,
There's a
because you're
glimmer of it
kind of
because
getting different world to start with
there's a
and
little
picking a
glimmer of
different
it.
hand to start with.
There's
Yeah,
a glimmer of it, but it's not that the game
got a
itself
sheen, a
is
sheen of a
a
variable
sheen
setup.
of it. But it's not different every time, more or less. It's more or less the same game, but you get to start with really different incentives. I think Race blurs the line in
Okay.
that way. I think for me, what I want to highlight about variable setup here, more so than like just the randomness that comes out of it, is that the game itself can be fundamentally different while having a shared rule set that makes it easier to play. So what makes it replayable is that you have a different, unique experience each time you play, slightly, right? And that has other benefits in that sort of the skill ceiling is higher, or the agencies that you get to practice are different because your unique player power lets you do something fundamentally different in that game, right? So the appeal of it is different.
I think for me, I hear what you're saying, but I think having a new hand of cards, a different hand of cards than I've had any time before in Race for the Galaxy at the start of the game feels like a dissimilar setup, a variable setup, or in like a game like Bonfire. I don't have a hand of cards, but the way the board is seated is random, right? It's like different, and I'm going to have to pick a new path through the game every single time. Or
Yeah.
in Bruges, there's no variable setup on the board, but everybody's going to start with a hand of 5 cards, and it's similar to Race, right? That to me feels like a variable setup outside of the two ways that you have
Laid out.
of scoring or agencies. It's kind of the same agencies, but it's just like a new experience to go into.
This is a hidden third category that I'm
Okay.
going to pivot. Different opponents in co-op games. So one example of this is in Spirit Island. Spirit Island is this game where you each play as spirits defending an island, and you all have your own unique powers within those spirits. But then you can also play against different opponents, different colonizers who are coming to the island, all of which themselves have different powers. I think this is another variable setup that can keep things interesting, right? So if you really like playing as one of the spirits, say Thunder Speaker or whatever, but you want to have a different experience, you can play against a different colonizer and have that game feel demonstrably different. And then there's a mix and match element to that we'll get into later, right? Where there's like you all of a sudden, if you have different spirits and different opponents, the number of different variants of what can exist just explodes into unique sort of gameplay experiences that you can have. Star Wars The Clone Wars is a new co-op game that has something similar where you can play against like Count Dooku, or I haven't played it, so I don't really know, but like that's
Darth Vader.
Sure, General Grievous.
Darth Small.
I think actually, Jake, I'm going to correct you really quickly because I don't want you to get blown up in the comments. In Star Wars The Clone Wars, Darth Vader does not yet exist because he's currently Anakin Skywalker, but I hear your point.
Yoda.
is not a villain.
Yeah, I was trying the whole time. I was trying to think of another villain, but I couldn't.
For sure. But it's just like different.
Anakin Skywalker.
There you go.
Who
Though a hero at this point, but yes.
So you see, technically speaking.
And I think this is sort of a twist on like, it's a little bit of a different, dissimilar scoring. A lot of co-ops don't have scoring, but the victory condition might feel slightly shifted, or the agency of what the game is doing to you sort of shifts.
Yeah.
I think also,
challenge. Okay.
Yeah. Can I add one last thing?
Yeah.
I think for me, part of the fun of variable setups also is that different types of fun can exist within the same game rule set because of those different agencies that you might be given. So whether it's dissimilar scoring, like or dissimilar agencies like unique asymmetric player powers, just the type of things you might experience end up being slightly different because of the combination of things in play. And I think that's key. The combination of things in play is what leads to the replayability.
Yeah. I think like a deck construction game also could be like a dissimilar agency, right? I'm bringing a new deck to attack this game differently.
Yeah.
So those type of games tend to be highly replayable as well. To
Magic the Gathering came to mind for me a huge amount in writing these notes just because of that. And yeah, I think every time you roll up to say like, oh, today I'm going to play like a green-white weenie deck, or today I'm going to play blue control, like you're playing the same game, Magic the Gathering, maybe in the same set, but it feels totally different in terms of what you're experiencing. Yeah. I think that's hugely a big part of it. Yeah.
And you have to ask, who's the beatdown?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about randomness, right? Please.
It's always Darth Vader. Okay. You do randomness. I've been talking a lot.
Okay. Well, we already hinted that randomness is going to be a part of the replayability conversation. I think randomness is an important element because it makes the game exciting. A game that doesn't have randomness, though, as I say this, I immediately think of chess, a game with no randomness. That's probably the most replayed board game of all time. I think having randomness makes a game exciting to go back to because you can't know for certain what the experience is going to be. That's going back to Can't Stop. That's what makes us want to play Can't Stop again. It's not like doing the math. It's like rolling the dice and seeing what the result of our kind of back of the napkin calculations is.
Yep. I think for me too, a huge part here, Jake, is we've talked about how interesting drafting games are to us in terms of the replayability of them. You've played an immense amount of challengers. I've played an immense amount of challengers. I've played a ton of Seven Wonders. We kind of sort of honed this idea that like, oh, it turns out we love to play drafting games a lot. On our last episode, Star Realms being another example. And I think a huge part of that is that randomness keeps the player on their toes, making interesting tactical decisions consistently. And in drafting games, that comes to the forefront of the decision space, right? It's fun to get better at making decisions in a game. It's even more fun to get better at making interesting decisions in the game when the decisions aren't always the same. And randomness just plainly and simply makes that possible. So if you have enough options and enough different outcomes, it's rare you'll ever get fully bored of a game, meaning it's probably going to continue to be replayable so long as it has another factor we'll talk about in a little bit, depth, because you're consistently being offered a new problem to solve and increasingly have tools to solve it.
I think Challengers is a great example for this one so I'm glad you brought it up, because I think what makes Challengers so replayable is that you have such limited agency and control over the drafting portion of the game. If you could see many more cards each time, I think the game would get duller faster because people would be playing the same type of decks more often, or you'd always be able to build one of like 2 or 3 best archetypes. Where the game is fun is that you can't do that because you're constantly posed with challenges of like, well, the card I really want isn't here, so what is my next best option?
Challengers is also interesting because the resolution mechanic is also so random, which makes it such that the right decision isn't often clear. Oftentimes a decision that, maybe if a computer could get at the game of Challengers, it could just analyze the whole card set, the whole position that you're in, and say, oh no, you have to take, if you're offered Heroine versus T-Rex in pack 3, pack C, you take T-Rex. But when you're playing, maybe you say, I don't know, it feels pretty close. I guess I'll go into heroin because I think, I want to try to get
And
get a pair
then
of it.
you win because the game is random.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and you're like, oh, heroin is the right choice here
Yeah.
every time.
And it's just bias. And
Yeah.
yeah. And the
So
feedback makes it more but I think that's a good
I
point
think
that,
that's interesting because I'm not
yeah,
sure I necessarily agree that like cloudy feedback versus clear feedback.
makes it more replayable.
Yeah, I think it works in challengers, but I think
Yeah.
in another game, perhaps having clearer feedback would make it more replayable or
Yeah.
less replayable. I don't know. I think it just also depends on the kind of player you are. That feels like it speaks a little bit more to personal preference
Sure.
to
And
me.
your motivations, right? The learning curve of the game, why you're there.
Like it works in challengers, but we also like love challengers.
Right.
Where I
Yeah.
think other people have bounced off challengers, making it not replayable to them for similar reasons because it
Reasons.
just feels like too random.
I think that other games that came to mind to me of that are so replayable because of their randomness, in terms of games we've covered on the show and enjoy, are games like Castles of Burgundy or Kingdomino or Welcome to, where there's just this steadfast and wonderful puzzle at the heart of this game. And what makes that puzzle consistently interesting is that the input randomness keeps it fun, right?
In
Like
all those games, it makes it so you can't always do like randomness
what you want.
prevents you from doing what you want,
Yep.
and that's what's most fun is figuring out like okay the backup plan.
Yep.
Like I want to start by getting these mines in Castle Burgundy, but I can't because I don't have the right numbers or somebody took them first. So now what?
Yeah. I think too, and just sort of like riffing on a game I already mentioned, like Cascadia, I mentioned the dissimilar scoring, the different animal scoring tiles. I think there, the puzzle of the animal scoring tiles is actually super straightforward. Like you can always you just look and you see what you can draft and get the most points of. But the terrain puzzle ends up being like really interesting from a randomness perspective, where you don't necessarily know what you'll be able to pivot into or what animals might be on those terrain tiles in an interesting way. So it makes for an even more solid puzzle kind of layered over this more accessible sort of direct puzzle that might even lean into the kind of automatic decision space at times.
Great. Let's go on to the next category.
Okay. So this next category is varied game arcs. So I think this is a really insightful and interesting one where if a game plays out the exact same way every time in terms of the shape of the experience, it's a 60-minute game and you're going to have the most exciting moment always at around the 35 to 40-minute mark. All of a sudden, I think that starts to be a little bit less exciting and a little bit less replayable than if it's a 60-minute game where sometimes in the first 10 minutes, you're going to have such a memorable experience that you're going to tell your friend about it 3 years from now, versus sometimes the most exciting moment is the very final one, the reveal of who wins. And other times it's really the mid game where it's the 30-minute mark where there's this pivotal weird interaction that's just funky and fun. I think varied game arcs keep games replayable in a way that maybe we haven't even talked about on the show a ton, right? There's things, the Resistance comes to mind for me a little bit, Jake. Not always completely, right? Because there's this really structured arc that game tries to set based on the number of people that are going on missions, based on the player count. But I think at times pivotal information comes out in different ways, and there's funkiness around votes that can just kind of upend that game. And because even at the lowest player count of 5, there's multiple spies. So there's this interesting potential intrigue of when is the one spy maybe going to throw the other spy under the bus, under the bus, outing one another. I think this is really key. Codenames falls into this category for me too, in large part thanks to the Assassin, the card that could be an auto loss. No two games feeling alike, I think, is a huge part of what keeps games feeling replayable potentially.
I think Resistance is a great example, and especially when you're the spy, because it's a game where first to 3 that team will win. So generally in the first mission, it's kind of like, yeah, it's good if your team wins, but if you're a spy and you're on that mission of 3 people with one other spy,
Mm-hmm.
and you're kind of thinking about like, oh, which one of us is going to like throw
Fail
in
this
a
mission.
fail, and then like potentially both of you do. that's the
Ugh.
game, right? Then you've just lost in the first round because somebody, like, they know that 2 of those 3 people are 100% spies.
Yep.
So yeah, it's funny how like navigating that could be like the pivotal, most tense moment in that game where you play, 10 other games of it and you won't have that same arc
Yep.
again.
When we played Blood on the Clock Tower at Geekway to the West, Jake, it really sort of hit on this varied game arc replayability experience for me. There's a lot going on, right? The variable setup in that game is wild. But I think for me, a huge
Yeah,
part of
it was highly replayable because we kept messing it up and having to replay it.
oh my
We
gosh.
mess it up and have to
That's the hidden seventh factor. How difficult is it to get the rules right? But I think for me, part of the varied game arc factor here is the ability to have memorable stories come out of the games that you play. And for me, a big part of games that are replayable, if I can play a game and walk away from it with a story that I'm going to tell my friends about, that feels like a really good use of my time. And it means I might be more likely to keep playing that game in search of more memorable stories. So examples of this are like the Resistance comes up again in this category. Cosmic Encounter comes up for me in terms of memorable stories that I can share with people. Keyforge is a great example where there'll just be wild interactions or wild decks that are like so interesting and fun, where for years I would even just play online and I would maybe message you or message people in a Discord and be like, this crazy thing happened and I need to tell you all about it, you know? And part of what makes it replayable is chasing more crazy, interesting things that I can then tell people, this actually happened in a game. Can you believe it?
Yeah,
You know?
totally. I wanted, just before we move on to the next one, I want to linger on the co-op example again, because we don't spend a lot of time talking about cooperative games on this podcast. And I feel like this might be even more important in
In
co-op
co-ops.
games than in
Yeah.
other forms of games, because in a lot of co-ops, like even if it's not like a narrative game, it feels more like the story is important.
Mm.
And I'm thinking of games like
Like the emergent
Pandemic.
story.
Yeah,
You mean
right,
the
the
emergent story.
the emergent story that you're telling, like
Yeah.
Pandemic and like Aeon's End, or whatever. And Aeon End is the one I wanted to specifically talk about because the first time I played that game, and it feels like, oh, we're definitely doomed. It's over. We've lost. This is a disaster. And then you pull it out on like the last turn and the tides turn, and then you win. Everybody's like high-fiving each other. You're like, this is awesome. And then you play it again, it's like the exact same thing. You're like high-fiving, you're like, that's awesome. And you play a third time, and if it's like the exact same experience again,
Yeah.
then you start like looking out of the corner of your eye, like, wait, is like, is this actually like a game that you can improve at and get better at and have
Yeah.
different experience, or is this just like a little bit on rails? And I don't
Yeah.
think that one is, because there's a lot of different cards you can shift in. You can up the difficulty, and I think Spirit Island kind of falls in that too. Like at the easy difficulties, it kind of has an inevitable power curve where you start out
Yeah.
behind, but by the end you're gonna snowball and run away with it.
Yep.
So I think it's super important that co-op games think about and address this, or else it feels too on rails.
I think this is a huge part of what makes board games potentially replayable too. I think a lot of video games, I know we're going to talk about them a little bit later if we have time, tend to be a little bit more scripted. Whereas with board games, part of the fun is the potential chaos of like feeling like anything could happen. I think that even, Jake, in terms of varied game arc, a game that came to mind to me when I was writing these notes, which is so interesting because it's such a structured gameplay, sort of like almost on rails experience, is Imperial 2030, where our play of that, when we played it, I felt I could imagine, even though it's a rondel game where you have to make the same decisions in roughly the same order each time, potentially skipping ones and having meaningful sort of passing on whatever you do, could have played out so differently in terms of where the pivotal conflicts happen, that could completely reshape everything and completely reshape the tension around ownership of certain countries and all of that in a way that makes me want to play it again, because I just playing it once felt like and saw, oh, this gameplay arc could be so different, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Being able to visualize a different gameplay arc and be like, I want to try that.
Yep.
That is something that will get it back to the table. Let's
Totally.
go to the next one, which is interaction, right? So this is, I think I accidentally dipped into this earlier, but this is this variance without randomness. So
Boom.
like Castles of Burgundy, it's not randomness if somebody takes the mines before you and forces you to do something else. That's interaction, baby.
Yep. And chess. There's no randomness in chess, but it's different every time two people play because you make very different decisions in terms of your opening moves and how you react to what your opponents do that mean that the problems that you're asked to solve in a given puzzle are really different. And I think Jake and I are going back to chess a little bit in terms of this episode as an example, because I think it feels a little bit like an anomaly in terms of the structure of that game and why people come to it. We'll talk about it again later in terms of like competitive motivation and structure.
I do think in some ways it's like an exception
It's
that
like a
proves the
cheat.
rule type
Yeah.
of thing, like, which is a saying I've never understood in full disclosure. Like, what does that even mean?
An exception that proves the rule.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels a little
I feel like that's like,
highfalutin there.
yeah, it's just like so dismissive of like a strong like counter example.
Sure.
Yeah. Like I can't understand that, so I just like that's just proves what I was saying even more.
Yeah. I think that for me, Jake, interaction is this incredible vehicle for replayability because the game's agencies and skill become so focused on not understanding the sort of the mechanisms themselves, right? Like what are the probabilities around this certain thing that I'm speculating on in the game paying out in points at coming to fruition versus what do I think Jake is going to do in terms of when he's under pressure, being threatened by two different players in the corner of the board, right? Like it shifts from this purely mathematical sort of approach to games, which Jake and I can both love. Like Castles of Burgundy is a pretty mathematical game that we both really enjoy. But when you shift towards something like Guards of Atlantis 2, where it's a tabletop MOBA game all about what people are going to do and reacting to what people do, I think it makes it even more replayable because you're trying to understand another human being and exploit that understanding. These are the types of games that I tend to really enjoy, so that's my bias kind of coming to the forefront. But I think that's interesting. Understanding other human beings is interesting. And if games end up being a meaningful vehicle for doing that, that can be a lot of fun.
I agree with you to an extent. Like, I think when people say this game is multiplayer solitaire, which is something that I, honestly, more often than not think is a silly thing to say.
Dismissive, yeah.
Yeah, dismissive thing to say. But I think that's coming from a place of saying, like, this game doesn't have enough interaction for me to find it replayable, which is a totally fair sentiment to express. People will have, everybody's different, and how much interaction you want in a game to be replayable is also going to span the spectrum. For me, Castles of Burgundy has plenty of interaction in that we're competing in a shared marketplace for the same tiles. If you take a tile that I want, I can't have it. I have to change my plans because of something that you've done. And it may not be like in the same way that you're trying to like understand if you're going to attack or defend on a move in Guards of Atlantis. I, on a previous term, have to decide, like, are you more likely to be, trying to compete for the boat majority or the field majority, and what tile is that going to make you more likely to pick on your turn, which is going to inform my choice. I think it's playing in the same space. It just feels like more indirect or direct. But whatever way you want your interaction, I think a replayable game needs some of it in the board game setting.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I don't know if I totally agree because I could like replay Welcome to solo forever.
Yeah. I mean, like video games like Tetris, right?
Sure.
That's a super replayable game with no interaction.
And no variability, but high randomness. I think if you lose the interaction, you need high randomness, Yeah. You just need something.
And maybe it's just that, like, I think an idea we come to a lot in these conversations are like, these are all things that make it more likely to have replayability, but nothing is going to be like completely prescriptive. Probably the more of these things that exist in the game, the more it'll feel replayable to like a larger subsection of board gamers.
Yep. this point of not all games need all these factors, and it's also a matter of taste, what type of games you're going to gravitate to, right? Like some people prefer less randomness in their games, so they might like more interaction. Some people like less interaction in their games, and they might like more just sort of core random input output randomness mechanisms, you know? Another thing is, Jake, I think that for me, Barrage is a perfect example of interaction leading to this like interesting variance without randomness, where when I'm playing this like strategy Euro game and someone makes a what seems like kind of funky decision to me, there's still so much agency and skill in that game of figuring out how to navigate around that weird decision that it keeps the decision space really compelling and interesting, because I have the ability to react meaningfully to weird decisions perceived by myself to be weird. And then knowing within that ecosystem that kind of bubbles to the top and is created through that, to know that you have a different puzzle to solve every time, right? Like a lot of these things like interaction, variability, and randomness are all the same thing. Is there a different puzzle to solve in this game every time?
There you go.
That's the crux of this, right? So with interaction, the different puzzle comes from every time you play a game with new players, it feels a little bit like a new game because the agency is so high.
This is really interesting because I think this gets me to start thinking that like perhaps there's like subsets of like replayable games and like Tigris and Euphrates and Castles of Burgundy and Guards of Atlantis II and chess are all over here.
Yeah.
And Tetris is, in or some other, it may be cooperative games, right? And to some large extent are doing something different to be replayable.
Because of the randomness versus player interaction?
Just because of like the different puzzle to solve. Like, okay, I shouldn't have thrown in cooperative
Tetris
game.
is the same puzzle every time.
Tetris is always the exact same puzzle, where all these other things are pulling in different elements that, to your point, which I think is a very good one, are creating a different puzzle to solve.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Tetris is just Tetris.
Dude,
but it's
another
really
exception, but it totally proves everything we're saying. Just trust me.
Yeah, 100%. Do you think, okay, so
it is a video game. So
It is. But I think even Tetris on the table, I don't know. I think you could make some pretty interesting decisions.
My city is like pretty dang not interactive.
But so replayable.
Highly replayable. Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot away from interaction because I think we kind of covered it. Though, of course, like the knowledge of past behavior of your opponents in interactive games makes playing those games even more, replaying them more interesting. I think that's a factor with interaction as well.
Before we get, finish. You can finish that. I would say before we get to the very like last one.
Yeah,
I've been like, I had a really interesting question that I came up with, and then I forgot it, and I've just been like for like 15 minutes, it's been like on the tip of my tongue, and I remembered it.
Good. What is it?
That's a teaser. We'll get to it after we finish this last category, which is depth.
Did you write it down?
Yeah, I wrote it down.
Okay, thank goodness.
I don't have edit access to your notes somehow, so I had to type it somewhere else, but I have it.
Okay, thank goodness. Okay, so the final category is depth, right? A simple game that isn't very deep might have interaction, it might have randomness, it might have a variable setup, and it might even have non-automatic decisions. I'd have to think more about that. But if a game doesn't have depth, it's not going to be very replayable. So I think what we mean by depth here,
strategies in Tetris are just nuts.
I think it's depth here, right? Well, I think there's a quality there, Jacob, in terms of setting up combos in Tetris.
Oh, okay. All right. Hey.
Okay. But it's not a game that's not easy to grok or solve. That's mostly what I think Jake and I mean here when we're talking about depth, because this isn't an episode about depth. We can't just go super deep on what we mean. It's a game that's hard to fully grok, a game that's hard to fully understand, and it's a game that's unlikely to become stale in terms of the decisions themselves.
Yes. I think for me personally, the thing that makes me replay games the most is a feeling like I'm getting better at it.
There's more
to learn. And I think depth is the main thing that facilitates that.
Yeah.
If I think it's really closely tied probably to the non-automatic decisions, because the reason depth would become an issue, right, and become something that prevents replayability is if I feel like the game is solved for me. Kind of like what you're feeling with Villagers. Perhaps to you, I might say that's less an issue of like automatic decision, but that like you feel like the game is kind of shallow,
Yeah.
and
I
that's
think
why the
that's true.
decisions have like become rote.
Yeah. I think
Even
that's
though I
really
disagree
fair.
with that, I like challengers.
You mean Villagers?
Yeah, shit,
Yeah.
Villagers.
I
Yeah.
like Challengers too. Okay.
I love challengers so much. It's just like coming out
It
on
just comes
accident.
out.
Yeah.
So also here, right? There's potential for depth through like it's just a massive decision space, like a game like Feast for Odin, which has over 70 worker placement spots or something like that, right? Or Agricola or Keyflower, whatever. Or there's huge mechanism overlap / interaction. So with that, I want to mention Spirit Island again, a game where the depth comes in part from I could be playing one spirit, Jay could be playing another, our friend John could be playing another. And then every time we play, if we all switch, the number of combinations and the way those powers interact is just really deep and interesting and meaningful. And then you add on top of that whatever the opponent we're playing against, and then all of a sudden it just explodes combinatorically into this wildly deep decision space that's interesting and meaningful. And I think that all of those are key factors. And we can't really go that much deeper on depth in an episode about replayability besides saying that like depth matters. And if the game, one thing that can make a game really replayable is if there's a lot to understand about it. And that's really, it feels obvious and like we could take it for granted almost, but I think it's important to say.
I'll add one other thing about depth, which is how I think it kind of interacts with the variable setup and like variability we were talking about before, where I think a game like Root or a game like Randomness 2 it has a lot of depth within each of those dissimilar agencies, the setup differences, because like they almost make you want to like main a character, where it's like, oh, I really like playing the Medusa character in Guards of Atlantis 2. When we played it, we've only played it a few times, but it was like I want to keep playing this character because like I like learning better how to use the stuff. And I think Root, I don't know that I think the culture of Root or whatever is people are like to shift around a lot, but you could do the same thing, right? You
Yeah,
could
I
like
just play crows.
really play crows and like really like figure that out. And
Yep.
or like with Magic or whatever, like you go deep in like a certain strategy or tactic, and
I'm a beatdown
that has a
player.
lot of depth. Whereas a game we just talked about, Santa Monica, has like variability of end game scoring, like dissimilar scoring, but we didn't find that change the decision space, meaning like it didn't feel like, I think that is kind of a way to put some of our, I don't know, criticism feels strong, but our feelings towards Santa Monica's end game scoring is like, yes, it adds variability, but it didn't pack the punch of like extra depth, meaning we just it didn't feel like it was adding that much to make us like go back to the game to play the different things more. And I think for me, the Cascadia animals kind of a little bit like, yeah, it's adding a ton of variability, but it's still sort of the same puzzle
each time. Yeah. Teach their own. What's your question? Hit me with it.
Okay, I think this kind of fits into our does replayability even matter? But I was thinking about this, which is like the games I play the most. So I thought about it because of your definition, which I'll remind the
Okay.
listener, a game that players can repeatedly play without tiring of the experience of playing it. And when I was thinking about that, it's like, you know what, the games I get the most tired of are the games I play a ton. And so I like don't know what to do with that, but like like Monikers is a game I gave away because everybody always wanted to play it, and so it's like a game that like and I had fun when I played it. It was like always coming to the table. Like the same with like Catan. Like I played it like 100 times in college, and now I like choose not to own it because I feel like I've exhausted that space. But like a lot of games that I might hold up now, like in this conversation, like, oh yeah, dude, like, I don't know, Barrage is like endlessly replayable, but I can't really say that if I had played Barrage 100 times, I wouldn't feel exactly the same way that I do about Catan towards that.
I think for you, Monikers and Catan were highly replayable games that eventually you've played enough of,
So I got tired of it. So it
Yeah.
doesn't fit your definition.
Okay, no, it does, because the add on to the definition, highly replayable games without tiring of them after X amount of plays, whatever. Like,
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Like Oh yeah, no, I agree. Like,
But I mean, it's like kind of. I think there's like it is sort of interesting where.
it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for. We can move on with the conversation now.
Well, I think that. Well, let me comment. Let me comment. I think there's this nuanced difference between like a game I would want to replay endlessly and a game I do and then get tired of. Right? Where those are different things. Where like you've played Catan 100 times or whatever, and I've probably played Catan 100 times or whatever, but I don't want to play it 100 more times in my life.
Right.
But I'm happy I played it 100 times.
And there are games I've played 100 times that I do want to play
Yeah.
more of, like Magic: The Gathering.
Sure.
So, I feel like that is a game that I could say is like, more. Both of them are obviously like replayable games. I know I'm being like a little bit silly, but one of them really fits that like truly like I keep playing this, like never get tired of it.
Would
Although
you?
if I played only Magic: The Gathering for the way I was playing it previously, maybe I'd get tired of it again.
Do you think you'd be willing to play? So, like Monikers, one of the things is it comes with a box of cards, and you kind of start to learn what's in the box in terms of the cards that are there. Do you think if your same friend group was like, let's stop playing Monikers, but let's play Celebrity, and we'll just write whatever we want on the cards every time? Would you be interested in it, or is it that the experience itself?
I would rather, I think, play something else.
Okay.
But definitely part of it. That's a good point. Definitely part of it is like
No variable setup.
It has something definitely not to the extent of Cards Against Humanity, where it's like,
Sure.
like it's just like handing players jokes.
Making
but
the
there
same poop
is
joke.
definitely something about Monikers being like, oh, this is like so funny that they put like this person or like
Sure.
thing in the game. So like they're handing you punchlines in like a very like kind of like a hidden way.
It's kind of like
it makes your group feel like, oh, we're like making these jokes and like we're so clever and funny, but it's like that's like a very designed experience.
Yeah, it's kind of like narrative in books, right? Where like it's about the surprise being gone from the box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
something about like where it's like in Monikers, it's like, it's like so funny that we like came up with like this
combination
or like this like charade for this topic, which of course like probably like somebody
was
intended for you to do it and have that experience. And it's still a fun experience, but anyway, that's my Monikers rant.
Okay, Jake.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a replayable game and a good game?
Okay, that's a great question. I think like there can be board games that fit into like the book category of like, I've played it, what a great experience, and I don't feel like I need to go back to it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of examples of that now, but I feel like there's like definitely I've had experience like playing games, especially games that like I get to the end of and I'm like, I feel like I like accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in the game. And people will like maybe rightfully like criticize that and say that's like not a good game then if you could like do everything that you wanted. But if I had like a really satisfying like fun experience with it in that play, I think it still like can be a good game that I don't need to play more.
Yeah. I could imagine a game that was really socially intense to play that made me feel interesting things and maybe sort of reflect in interesting ways about the experience of playing it, being a game that I thought was a really good game that I didn't need to go back to and replay a lot.
Alice is Missing is a recent one I played with my Laughing Table Friends game group. That was like awesome. I love my experience.
But you
don't need to feel like that was well worth the time and effort. And like I've had the Alice is Missing like experience that I wanted to have.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of long games. I know I said I wanted to replay Imperial 2030 on the show, and I still do. But I think that's another game that I think is a good game that I'd also be happy not replaying it if I
see it on
didn't get a
myself,
chance.
and I certainly haven't been like real motivated to be like So the Laughing Table Friends game group, we have 5 members, and we sort of rotate through like who gets to pick.
Yeah.
And my turn's come up a few times since then, and I've looked at it and been like something else.
Yeah. But you enjoyed your experience.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I do want to play it again, like intellectually.
Yep.
But then but then, when I'm looking at my game shelf and like what of these things do I most want to get to the table, it hasn't been that one yet. Not saying it never will be. But
a lot of that too is like the opportunity cost of how long it takes to play a game, how different you feel that different experiences of it could be. There's a whole lot there.
Yeah, we just talked about 6 different categories.
factors that could play into that. Yeah. Another thing that we didn't talk about is potential for like gimmick experiences. And I use gimmick in a positive way here, more or less, or in quotes. So things like the mind, where it's a really novel experience you can have with a group of people, but playing it with the same group of people over and over again might not be as fun as playing it with different groups of people more than once and showing them like, hey, here's this neat thing we can do.
Yeah, and somebody somebody brought that up in our Discord. I would love to say who it was, but I think that's a really great point. Where I think they were talking about QE specifically, and that being a game they love to show to new groups of people, but playing it with the same group multiple times, it like loses for them that magic of like sort of like learning together and just like seeing what people do with like the crazy possibility of bidding any number you want, any number at all.
Yep. And that has the thing where the more you play it with one group, the more you build a standard of like how much things should go for. So the novelty of it kind of wears off.
Yeah, the mind fits in there too.
Yep. I think escape room games deserve a mention here somewhat for a similar idea, but the gimmick is just you're not knowing the puzzles that are contained within the box. It's not that much fun to solve the exact same puzzles multiple times. Whereas, so these are really fun games that you don't really want to replay. They can also be really good games that make you have a really fun time playing them or give you memorable stories or make you want to show them to other people in terms of saying, hey, you should play this, but aren't things that you can replay multiple times because they're not really made to be. There's narrative elements there too.
I looked up, it was Matt in the Discord.
Nice. Okay. Awesome.
Brought us that insight about QE. Thank you, Matt.
So does replayability even matter is another question that got posed to us. Yes and no. I think it, just like all media, it depends. So let's not dwell on it, right? Like there's certain games where I think by nature of games themselves, I want my games to be replayable. We talked about that at the start of the show. I'm more interested in a game that the 10th time I play it, I find I'm able to grapple with and have more meaningful interaction with the decisions I'm making than the first or second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth or ninth time. But at the end of the day, there might be a game where what it offers in one play is so fun and so interesting and so meaningful that it doesn't matter that I don't want to replay it again. It just depends. But on average, yeah, I want my games to be replayable. It's a huge part of the appeal.
I'll take it from a slightly different angle. I think we can get a little bit caught up at times in thinking like everybody who listens to this podcast is as obsessive with us or maybe like has chosen to spend as much disposable income on buying games. If you have a handful of games or perhaps only space in your apartment for like 5 to 10 games, it matters a lot more probably. Than if you're okay with, if you have space for 100 games and more coming in than going out, unfortunately, then it can be much more okay or even a benefit to feel like, I would like the whole legacy conversation where it's not about, oh, you can only play Pandemic Legacy 10 times. It's like, this is a game you'll actually play 10 times. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Jake.
But I would also say it doesn't matter in the other sense that like to my point, like the games that I play the most, eventually I'm probably going to get tired of damn near anything.
Yeah.
If I'm playing it over and over, which makes me think like it maybe doesn't matter as much as we might think. I feel like a big part of this hobby too is like searching for the ideal game for like every situation. Like we're always on the hunt for like the perfect, like most replayable game. But because of that hunt, even once we have it, we're still going to be trying to find the better version of it and like playing new stuff when it comes out anyway.
Yeah.
So as long as there's like awesome games coming out and people to play them with, that makes replayability of any one given game matter a lot less.
Yeah. Well said, Jake. Okay. Another thing that amplifies or potentially impacts replayability is competitive motivation and structure. We'd be remiss not to mention.
We don't have to linger on it, but yes.
No, almost any game can be replayable if you care about the additional impact of winning or losing based on a structure affixed to that game. I care about Seven Wonders more because I like to see my ELO go up on Board Game Arena than I would if I didn't care about that.
Yeah. External influences outside of the game can matter.
Yep.
I think I could be wrong about this, but I doubt many people who are professional poker players think Texas Hold'em is like the most interesting,
Fun game.
fun game that they would like to play casually with friends.
Yep.
But people endlessly replay Texas Hold'em because it's their job,
Yeah.
because they can make lots of money playing it. You can get on TV and become a famous poker player and write a book about your poker skills and strategies. All of those are things that are external to poker
Yeah.
that make it more replayable to many, many people.
Yeah. Well said. Okay, Jake, I don't know if we have time to talk about video games
Let's
and
just
legacy
touch on
games.
it like super duper fast.
Okay. Okay.
We're fine. We got an
Yeah,
hour and yeah, we got 10 minutes. If you have 10 minutes.
I absolutely do.
Okay.
So the last two things in the notes to Jake's at this point are just legacy games and video games. And I think they're grouped together for me in my mind because a lot of what these games and the replayability of them is kind of shared. Though video games are often way more replayable than legacy games. Legacy games are kind of this like thing in board games that Jake has alluded to, where the replayability of it is you want to get to the end. You want to finish the experience. You want to experience all of the narrative that are there. Or in a game like My City, experience the new rules every time you play it. Or even in a game like Pendemic Legacy, right? It changes over the course of the play. So a huge part of the replayability in those games are the motivation. It's the same thing why people have a hard time stopping books that they start, even if they're not enjoying the books halfway through. It's the desire to get to the end, to have a definitive experience as perceived by whoever is in that position in the first place, right? It's complicated. I think my definitive experiences of reading A Confederacy of Dunces, Jake, since we're having lots of asides on media, is that like I got a third of the way into the book and was like, this isn't worth my time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that happens with legacy games. It almost fits in like the external like thing too, where it's like outside of the core game, there's something that makes you want to go back to it, right? There's like the next envelope to open to see what's in there, what's going to happen next. That is going to literally, at least for me, be an external factor that's going to like elevate it on myself of like, what game should I play tonight? Well, it's like this is the one we're like in the middle of. I am a TV series finisher. My wife is a TV series like starter and like jump arounder. So we'll always, what do you want to watch tonight while we eat dinner? And I'm always like, well, we should like keep watching the show we started. And she'll be like, oh, well, I'm not really in the mood to watch that show. But I think for the same reason that I want to like get to the end of a TV series for once, like legacy games have that increased replayability appeal.
Yeah, totally. Okay.
All right. And lastly, for the last 5 minutes, we're going to talk about why video games are so damn replayable.
Well, where do you want to start?
Okay. So I mean, video games I think are more replayable in part just because there's way less burden to start playing. If you have like a phone app, you can just do it. There's no, you could be like literally on a call at work and like I just like do this game on my phone. I would never do that.
You sure?
Nor would I recommend it, but I know people do it all the time. Like you could never do that with a board game. Like I can't just be like on a work call and I just like am setting up and playing a board game with 3 friends.
So it's like easy.
Yeah.
It's easy to replay them. The barrier to playing the games is lower.
They're like, yeah, they fit into our whole world and environment seamlessly.
Okay, so I want to follow up on that point. So video games have quote like I'm going to call it self-governance, right? Like they implement the rules of the games themselves. When you go to play Mario, you don't have to know that Mario can only jump, X number of pixels. Mario just always jumps X number of pixels. So I think that for me, one of the things that makes video games really replayable in a way that's at odds with board games is that when I go in to play a board game, I have to fully understand the rules, right? I have to, as players at the table, we have to have perfect governance of what's there. At least that's the goal. Whereas with video games, you don't because they're self-governing. So it's a system that I could go in and explore. And instead of pursuing just mastery like I would with a board games, making optimal decisions within the rules that I understand, with video games, oftentimes part of the replayability for me is understanding. It's my chipping away at my understanding of the rules that will help me master the game.
It's
That
like
becomes fun.
it's like it takes the burden of learning the rules off of the player's shoulder and like inserts that as added depth.
Yeah, totally.
You know, like the rules become depth in the game that you're like slowly
Well said.
figuring out as you play, which makes it immediately easier to get started and in some ways
More fun to replay.
more fun, more replayable than many video games. A big part for me too is just I know we both feel the same way, but like mastery of it that gets the same with like mastering the jumps that Mario's able to do
Yeah,
in fighting games, a genre that we both like. You like Pokken, I like Super Smash Bros.
yeah,
There's just like infinite room to get better technically at like performing what's in your brain, what you would like
yeah,
to do at the same time as like you can also improve like your knowledge and like understanding. Like as you're getting better at like physically executing things in the game, you're also getting better at like knowing what you want to and should execute and even like are able to imagine new things to do with your character in
totally.
different situations.
Other humans can do this thing in this game. I've seen it and I want to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, and
I'm
so
going
it's
to keep
like
replaying it until I can do it.
so it's like mastery is happening on all different levels where in board games it's only happening on the intellectual level
It's
of
not
like
often execution.
imagination. Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost
Outside of
never.
like a dexterity game.
A dexterity game, right.
I think a huge part, this video games is such a broad category that it's really hard to, but a huge part of it too is potentially with narrative video games, something that you have that's different in narrative video games than say like a book or a movie is different endings based on player decisions
More
within
plot
the
points
game or plot
throughout.
points. Right, totally. So my decisions within the game will change the narrative that plays out. I want to replay it more to better understand how my decisions impacted the narrative that I then get to experience as a player.
Skyrim is a narrative game, but it has a plot where you can like sort of join either of two sides in like a global conflict. So that makes it replayable. Also, you could do it as a wizard or an archer or a warrior, and those are going to give you like different agencies in the game as you choose your side as well.
Totally.
More replayability in a very similar way that we talked about earlier in board games.
Yep. No, definitely. And I think that a huge part of that too is just like potentially one thing. So there's one of just, if you just did it back to back to back, that's one thing. And another would be as human beings, we have bad memories. So if you experience a video game or a piece of media and you sort of say, oh, that was really interesting and fun, maybe a few years later, because I forget all the nuances, I go back and replay it. And then it's a little bit different the next time. And I think that's the same thing with puzzles in a game, and also could be the same thing in board games, right? Like if I play the Castles of Burgundy and then I don't play it for 3 years, maybe I want to go back to it and experience it again because I don't remember how to make all the decisions in it. But I think it's fun to have a similar, to like replay a plot or experience in a board game when you've forgotten some of it in the same way. And you know it might be exactly the same if you make all the same decisions.
Last thing I'll say about video games is I think like the feedback loop can be like so much faster and more efficient. If I'm playing Smash Bros against a friend, I lose. Okay, they play another game, it takes 2 minutes, I lose. I play another game, it takes 2 minutes, I lose. I play another game, it takes 2 minutes, I lose. I play another game, it takes 2 minutes, I win. You know what I mean? That's like I've played, 5 full experiences and seen like tremendous personal growth in 15 minutes on the couch. That's like equivalent in some ways to playing like 5-hour-long board games across 5 different evenings. So that's really satisfying. And it's not, I feel like a lot of this is coming across as us saying like video games are better. They're not.
Like, we don't have a podcast about video games.
Yeah. They're very different, but like I think replayability is something that like video games, just the medium of it, like excels in. It's so important for board games compared to films, but like perhaps video games is even like further on that spectrum.
I
At
think
least in the not like the Marios of the world, not necessarily the like super narrative games that are closer to a book.
Totally. I think a huge part of that too, Jake, is just thinking about all the factors that we laid out just to, as we close the show, mention them. Depth, interaction, varied game arcs, randomness, variable setup, non-automatic decisions. I think with video games, the fact that they are self-governing and in the way that board games aren't means that the potential for complexity and depth is just so high because the burden of players having to understand everything when they start playing isn't there. So I think of things like Dota, Defense of the Agents, Dota 2, and there's just the replayability is just so massive because the game, even compared to the most complex board games, is like astronomically more complex.
In the replay, like the amount people play these games
Yeah.
is like so mind-bogglingly large. Like I remember seeing some League of Legends video just talking about like just the number of like human hours of like time
Billions.
played in it
Yeah.
is like, you know, like I'll misquote it, but you know, they're talking about like how long, like how much labor and hours it took to like build the pyramids at Giza. Like, yeah, like League of Legend players would have done that like 10 times over, like last March or something.
Totally.
You know?
Like
So very replayable.
I've played Defense. I just checked because, you know, we're recording at our computer setups. I've played Dota 2. I haven't played it in years. The last time I played it was 2016. So it's been 7 years recovery. But I've played it 480 hours. So, you know, that's almost a month of my life. Maybe it's more. I haven't done the math, but I don't know of a board game I've played for almost 500 hours.
Yeah. So video games are good at it. And I think there are lessons to be learned as we continue to think about board games and design them in the ways that they can excel in replayabilities or not, and why it maybe doesn't really matter as much as we might like to think. I think I'm going to call this episode Replayability and Why It Doesn't Matter as like a little homage to our friends at the So Very Wrong About Games podcast. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea. And I think ultimately, you know, let's close on this idea, Jake, right? Like, would you rather have a game you could have an incredible experience playing one time or a game that you have to play 10 times to really have an incredible experience? I don't know.
Oh, that's a tough one. I as you started the question, I thought I was going to be like, I'll slam the one good experience.
Yeah.
But I think because of my own like penchant for like wanting to learn,
Yeah.
I think I'm going to get that more out of the 10 plays. I mean, obviously if it's not like, if it's like terrible plays, like in it, you know,
1 through 9.
I need more variables. You know, are we talking like a 4-hour game?
No. 40-minute game, 45 minutes.
A 45-minute game, like a 7 that rises to a 10.
Yeah.
Or like
a 7 that rises to a 10. Yeah, let's call it that. That's interesting.
I think I would even take like a 7 that rises to a 9 over like a 9.5.
I guess
with one play. Because I feel like in that growth, like that's what I want.
Totally. You and I are so biased because I also am just like, I got this group to play a game with me 10 times. This is amazing. Yeah.
Great question. I think that's an awesome question for listeners to weigh in on too. And I think we should call it there for this discussion about replayability. We'll call it there for the podcast. But of course, as we mentioned, the really rich stuff, the really good insights is coming from the listeners and friends in the Discord. So if you're not already in there, get in there. We would love to have more voices to weigh in and tell us what's what about replayability.
Also, Jake, you know, curates an Instagram on Decision Space called Decision Space. It's actually just search Decision Space on Instagram and you'll find it. You should follow it. He works hard on it. He posts stuff there sometimes. I should post some stuff there sometimes too. I probably will increasingly as I play more things in person that are beautiful to photograph. So check us out there. Check out more. If you enjoy our show and you want to support it financially so we can do more cool stuff in the future, check out decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon.
It's been a while since we got a new Patreon. So if you're at all inclined, that always makes us super happy. You know, and we're just talking about like $3-5 a month, you know, the price of a coffee at Starbucks, not even. Totally. That would be awesome.
The show is still in the red because we love to make it and we do it because we find it to be fun and enjoyable and we want it to exist. And if you want to help us move it slightly out of a thing that costs us money to something where we break even, we would super appreciate it.
If you're still listening to this now, you're the kind of person we're counting on.
Totally. Yes.
No pressure.
And then also thank you to Hembry for their hit song Reach Out, which we use as our intro and outro song. And then also, you've listened this long, you should know Jake and I are playing games like Heat and Ticket to Ride, if I can twist Jake's arm. Yeah, I think we should cover on the show.
For sure. That'd be fun. We are the Train Game Podcast, so it's probably time we cover a real train game.
All aboard.
All right. Goodbye.
Have a good night, y'all. Bye.